Ethan Walker stood before his floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights bleed into the rain streaks on the glass. The office was silent, save for the hum of the ventilation system. His phone vibrated against the mahogany surface of his desk. He did not look at it immediately, letting the rhythm of the device rattle the wood. When he finally turned, the screen illuminated a notification from his lead client. The contract was gone. A sudden market freeze had stripped the project of its value. This was the third time in 10 years he had received an email of this nature. The weight of the numbers hit him as he sat down, the screen glowing in the dim room. He tapped the desk once, twice, then pulled up the budget spreadsheet. The payroll column blinked back at him, a long string of obligations that needed to be met within the month. He scrolled past the losses, his eyes narrowing at the total. Outside, the rain intensified, blurring the skyline into a gray void. The storm was here again, and this time, the pressure felt heavier than before. He reached for his phone, tapped the contact for his lead engineer, and waited for the connection to bridge the gap. The call connected on the second ring. Ethan did not waste time on pleasantries. "Switch the focus, WS," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet of the office. "We drop the premium features. We build a cost-cutting tool for small shops. We have 3 weeks." The engineer's voice crackled back with a question, but Ethan cut him off. "The market is shifting. We follow the money." He hung up and stood, moving to the massive whiteboard that dominated the far wall. With a single, forceful motion, he wiped away the quarterly growth target's months of projections erased in a cloud of white dust. He picked up a marker and wrote one word in bold black letters: efficiency. The tension in his shoulders dropped as he stepped back to survey the new objective. He began typing on his laptop, reallocating resources, and stripping the platform down to its core, essential functions. The fear that had paralyzed the rest of the industry was nowhere in his movements. He was already building the next iteration. He hit enter, sending the new project parameters to the entire development team, and watched the status bars on his monitor begin to shift toward the new goal. The office lights flickered, throwing long shadows across the empty desks. Ethan stared at the blank whiteboard, but his mind wasn't in the room. He was back in his old living room, years ago, when the first recession had ground his life to a halt. He remembered the smell of stale coffee and the specific weight of the stack of unpaid invoices on his table. They were thick, white, and final. He had paced the floorboards until his feet ached, his chest tight with the reality of having nothing left to lose. He had pulled a worn, dog-eared copy of a book from his shelf, Napoleon Hill's work. His finger had traced a single sentence about adversity carrying the seeds of an equivalent benefit. He read it 3 times, the words grounding his racing pulse. He remembered the exact texture of the paper under his fingertip as he realized that the crisis was not an end, but a leverage point. He had sat there, surrounded by the debris of his first attempt at business, and finally stopped shaking. He had looked at the invoices not as debts, but as a roadmap for what people needed most. That memory was the bedrock of his current calm. He looked at the word efficiency on the wall and realized that the storm was merely a familiar rhythm. Ethan returned to his desk, the memory of the past fueling his present pace. He pulled the local directory toward him, his thumb flipping through pages until he reached the bakery listings. He dialed the first number, a dial tone, then a disconnect. He dialed the second. A voice answered, impatient and hurried. Ethan spoke, his pitch stripped of all sales fluff, focusing purely on the cost-saving data his tool provided. The owner hung up before he finished. Ethan took a breath, exhaled slowly, and dialed the third. The phone rang 6 times. He stared at the wall, his finger hovering over the end button. But then the line clicked open. He offered a simple, low-cost AI tool to track flour, sugar, and yeast inventory. He explained the math of waste reduction in plain terms. Silence on the other end, then a question about the setup time. Ethan walked him through the installation process, his voice steady and calm. By the time he hung up, the first contract was secured. He marked the entry in his ledger, his hand steady. He dialed the next number. By dawn, he had 4 more commitments. The fear of failure had been replaced by the rhythm of execution. Each call was a brick in the foundation of a company that would not fold. Ethan left his office and walked to the break room. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. His team sat around the laminate tables, staring at screens that showed red graphs and falling indices. He didn't sit. He walked to the wall, picked up a marker, and drew a clean, sharp line through the previous quarter's projections. The team looked up, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Ethan leaned against the table, his presence filling the tight space. "The market is shrinking," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room. He pointed to the blank space beneath his line. "But the need for survival is growing. We are done with luxury software. We are done with vanity features." He looked at each person, waiting for the flicker of realization. "From this hour, we build survival kits. Tools that keep shops alive when the cash dries up." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sharp. A developer near the window closed his laptop, unplugged it, and moved to the main workstation. The rest followed. No questions were asked. The atmosphere shifted from the dread of a dying market to the focused intensity of a rescue mission. They were ready for the climb. The office transformed into a high-pressure engine. Keyboards became a rhythmic, incessant clatter that filled the dark hours. Ethan walked the floor, coffee in hand, watching as the team stripped away layers of bloated features, leaving only the sharp, lean core of the new tool. Every line of code deleted was a step toward survival. Around 3 a.m., a server cluster flickered, threatening to crash the build. The air turned frigid as the ventilation system kicked in. A lead developer lunged for the terminal, fingers flying, patching the leak before the data integrity broke. Ethan stood behind him, watching the progress bars climb. They were not just coding. They were performing surgery on their own business model. By dawn, the platform was live. The first notification pinged, then another, then a cascade. 50 clients in rapid succession. The tension that had gripped the room for weeks shattered, replaced by the electric hum of victory. They watched the dashboard, the numbers ticking upward in real time. The market outside was in freefall, but inside these walls, they had found their pulse. They were no longer sinking. They were building. News arrived in waves. Another competitor shuttered their doors. Another firm announced mass layoffs. Ethan watched the industry bleed from the comfort of his office. While others slashed budgets and froze operations, Ethan pulled the lead engineer back into his workspace. He authorized a full expansion of the research and development budget. He did not tighten the purse strings. He loosened them. He poured capital into refining the user interface and doubling the support staff while the rest of the market went silent. It was a calculated risk that felt like a gamble to his investors, but Ethan saw the pattern clearly. Fear was a contagion that forced his rivals to retreat, leaving the market floor empty. He occupied the space they abandoned. He directed his team to reach out to every client left stranded by the bankrupt firms. He didn't just offer software, he offered stability. The phones in the support wing rang without pause. Ethan walked the rows of desks, watching his team handle the influx of new users with precision. By the time the quarter closed, his firm was the only one standing in the sector. The market dip had not crippled him, it had cleared the board. The young founder shifted in his chair, eyes darting between the steady, green growth lines on the screen and the chaos of the market reports. He leaned forward, palms pressing into the desk. "How did you survive this collapse when everyone else folded?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He pushed a glass of water across the wood, the condensation leaving a dark ring on the mahogany. He stood and walked to the wall. He pulled a folder from a hidden drawer and laid it open. It was a list of names, a long, grim index of companies that had ceased to exist over the last 3 years. Ethan tapped the paper with a steady finger. "Look at these. They all had capital. They all had talent. They all quit because they believed the winter would last forever." The founder stared at the names, his breathing slowing as the implication took hold. He looked up, waiting for a secret, a shortcut, or a complex algorithm. Ethan just shook his head. "There is no trick," Ethan said. "I simply keep the lights on. I wait for the storm to stop. It always does." The room went silent. The weight of that perspective hung between them, stripping away the panic of the market and replacing it with the cold, hard reality of persistence. Years later, the office was quiet. Ethan sat in the same leather chair, the leather worn soft at the edges. He clicked the final page of the audit report. The numbers were fixed, black ink on white light, a net worth crossing into 7 figures. He stared at the screen, but he did not see the digits. He saw the cold nights in his living room, the stack of unpaid invoices, and the bakeries he had cold called when the first recession hit. The wealth was not a prize for being clever. It was the sediment left behind after every flood. He closed the laptop. The lid snapped shut with a definitive click. He stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the glass. Outside, the city lights burned with a steady, unblinking rhythm. The market was calm. The volatility had exhausted itself. He watched the rain fall, no longer as a threat, but as a backdrop to a life built on the refusal to quit. The storm had passed, just as it always had. He felt the weight of the years in his shoulders, a physical confirmation of the distance he had traveled. He had turned every crisis into a structural layer of the company, a foundation made of sheer, stubborn endurance. Ethan moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had nothing left to prove to the clock. He reached for his coat hanging on the back of the door, the fabric heavy and familiar. He walked to the main switch. With one smooth downward motion, he cut the power. The soft hum of the servers died instantly, and the office plunged into shadow. Only the ambient glow from the city's street lamps filtered through the large panes of glass, casting long, stark lines across the desk. He stood in the silence for a moment, listening. The building was empty, yet it felt alive with the potential of what he had built. He did not look back. He opened the office door and stepped out into the quiet hall. The floorboards were cool beneath his feet. He adjusted his collar and took a steady breath, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The current cycle was finished, but the patterns of the world remained consistent. He knew the next storm would gather, and he knew it would break. He walked forward, his stride rhythmic and unhurried, ready to meet whatever the next season brought, with the same iron resolve that had carried him this far.